And good afternoon. Welcome. DL Doctor live stream is here on Monday at 1 o'clock, just like we said we'd be. And just like I said we have a special guest. Gene Harms from our Muskegon office is with us today. I want to give it a little background. In addition to being a realtor for Five Star Real Estate, Gene also has had an extensive background in environmental issues of various kinds, has worked for a number of companies over the years as project manager and environmental consultant on a number of things. So, quite often, our agents get a question on what do we do about an underground storage tank, or what do we do about radon, so on and so forth. And Gene has been kind enough over the years to provide that information, and I thought it would be great to have her on here, not just as a real estate agent who has provided free advice, but to also recognize her as a environmental professional who does in fact have her own consulting business. So while she's been kind enough in the past to provide free advice, I encourage you to talk to her about payment if you're going to head in that direction. It's only fair that if we have somebody who's an expert that we compensate them. But we'll answer a few questions for you today. Anything you'd like to say before I have some questions that are really very basic?
No, I just work part-time for an environmental consulting firm, so I am an employee, and they're based out of Traverse City, so I work from home part-time, and the company's called GEI Consultants.
Okay, GEI Consultants.
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna run through a few questions that I have.
Okay.
Do you have any questions that you've thought of today?
Not really. I just tried to do a little research because some of these areas I'm not very familiar with. My primary background recently has been asbestos primarily, so I did a little research on USTs and lead and mold and PFAS.
Okay.
So,
well, let's start with an easy one. One we get a question a lot, which is an estate is exempt from seller's disclosure of condition form, but is any seller exempt from providing a lead-based paint disclosure? Very often we get an estate property which is exempt from a seller's disclosure form, filling out a seller's disclosure form, but they also assume that they are exempt from filling out a lead-based paint disclosure form. And is that something you're familiar with or not?
I'm not very familiar. I would assume that since if the house was built before 78, then there would likely be lead, and the form is easy to fill out. So
Yeah.
they can just put in there constructed prior to 78. If there's no reports or testing done, then they can just state that.
Yeah. And to add to that, it is a federally mandated form. We don't have a control over it. It is not a state required form. It is a federally required form. So there is no exemption to the lead-based paint being completed. So there you have that one.
Perfect.
If you see black spots or shading on the basement walls, how do you know if it's mold?
How do you know if it's mold? I guess you would have it tested, but typically mold would be found in areas that are more damp or have water issues. So if you remove the water issue, then you remove the mold issue.
Okay, so you don't really know if it's mold or mildew unless you have it tested.
Correct, and there is no state certification for mold testing or mold abatement. It's pretty much at the homeowner's responsibility to take care of that. If it's too much for the homeowner to handle, they can hire a contractor to come in and do the cleanup, and if there's any building materials that need to be replaced, the contractor can do that too. But there's no state certification for mold abatement.
Interesting. You mentioned that if you get rid of the source of the problem,
Yes.
water,
Yes.
then the mold will die on its own. Is that what I'm hearing?
It won't grow. So there's always spores on everything, regardless of if there's mold, there's spores, and the spores have to have moisture to grow. And so when you remove that moisture problem, then you remove the mold growth. But there's, regardless if it's new, old, wherever it is, there's likely to be mold spores. It's just
And are those
preventing them from
mold,
growing.
are those mold spores, how do we know that mold or its spores are toxic? Do we know? That's a term I hear a lot, and I don't know.
It's not a very accurate term.
Okay.
So, what did I read up on this a little bit. So, they can produce toxic substances, but the molds themselves are not toxic. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes sense.
All right.
So
I think people are getting a little too carried away with this toxic black mold. It's only a problem if you have some health issues or asthma, which can exacerbate those conditions. But generally speaking, a healthy person isn't going to be affected by mold unless it's probably a considerable amount.
yeah. Next question I have here is the remediation approach different for mold in a home, in a home's attic versus the home's basement? And let me explain why I'm asking that question. I was involved in a sale where there was mold in the attic. It was obvious that it came from a ventilation from the bathroom where the
Okay.
shower was located, and it went up into the attic, and right above there was mold. Well, the problem was, as my mold expert identified, that they had somebody had stepped on the ridge vents and caused the ventilation in the attic to be greatly reduced. And his solution to that was to go buy new ridge vents, which we did, and lo and behold, we checked it months later, and the mold was gone. It was dead. It was gone. So, however, they weren't living in the attic. They were living in the house. So my question is, if it's in the basement, for example, where we see it a lot, I've even seen it on the main floor, is the remediation different or more immediate? Is there a more immediate need to deal with that than if it's in the attic, for example?
Is the basement occupied or unoccupied is another question. Is somebody living down there? Does it have finished space where you have somebody there that would be exposed to the mold more? That would be a question. And
So it's not so easy to simply say there's mold.
no,
There's a lot more that goes into the answer about whether or not it's toxic, whether or not it's going to affect someone's health, and how to remediate the problem. So, is that correct?
yes, it's not a simple answer.
It's not a simple answer.
No.
There's your answer. It's not a simple answer.
Yep, it's going
Okay.
to depend on a lot of different factors.
So, if your sellers, your buyers, encounter mold, don't assume that it's a big problem. Don't assume that it's not a problem. So it's not a simple answer.
It's not a simple answer. No.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jean. What is radon and how dangerous is it?
So radon is a naturally occurring gas from the decomposition of radium, which is in the ground. So the radium breaks down and it forms radon, which can mobilize in the soil. It can come up through basements, crawl spaces, substructures, and where it can accumulate in those areas. Radon is the number 2 cause of lung cancer. Number 1 would be smoking. The government has established a limit of 4 picocuries per liter as an upper limit for radon. Radon is found in every 50 states, and there's elevated levels in all those states. Depending on where you're at, the levels may be lower.
So I know that years ago in Grand Rapids, I heard real estate agents say, we don't test for radon because we don't have radon here. Laugh.
That's funny.
Yeah,
No,
that's the laugh.
it can be anywhere.
It can be anywhere.
Yes.
Even in Grand Rapids. And in
Yes.
fact, the reason that we didn't have radon problems in Grand Rapids is because we didn't test for it. Kind of makes it obvious. So I'm going to just draw a little, this is Don and his artwork moment, which ought to scare everyone.
Okay.
Okay, just so we're clear. This is a house.
Mm-hmm.
This is the surface, the grass, if you will. This is everything underneath. This is a sump pump, for example. Now, when there are heavy rains and or a frost line freezes here, what happens to the radon?
It goes to the area of least resistance.
It goes right to the area of least resistance, like cracks in the basement floor, or a sump pump crock, and so on. So, in situations like this, where the ground is soaked and essentially creating a water barrier, or the frost line is creating a barrier, are the radon levels in that home going to be higher or lower than in, let's say, midsummer when everything's pretty dry?
They'd likely be higher, also because your home is closed up, and so you're not getting the ventilation from outside. So you have those two factors.
So you got two factors.
Yes.
You got a closed up house, and you have radon following the path of least resistance. Normally, it would go straight up through the ground and into the air. So I want to kind of create a mental picture that depending upon the circumstances, the environment, time of year, and so on, you may find different radon levels in the house than you
Yes.
would at a different time.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. What's the difference between active mitigation and passive mitigation?
Active and passive.
Okay, I'm going to help.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know there's a fan involved.
That's the active one. Okay, so back here, we're going to go back here.
Upside down.
A passive mitigation is going to get, there's going to be a lid on the sump pump crock. That's the first step. You're going to close off any potential entrance to the basement from, with, let's say, a sump pump crock. If there are cracks, you're going to silicone them close. You're going to fill those in with silicone or a hydrating cement that essentially expands into the cracks. You're going to seal that off so that radon cannot come in. It doesn't mean that it's going to eliminate it entirely, but it can reduce it significantly. It can drop from, let's say, 6 picocuries per liter down to, maybe 2 or 3, and get it within the range that is acceptable to the EPA. A active system will actually knock through the basement floor and create a pipe that goes up into the air, and it will create through the motor the negative pressure to suck all of the air out from under the basement that has the radon in it.
Mm-hmm.
And it will basically take it up through the pipe out into the air and avoid it collecting in the house. Does that help?
Yes.
I need to go back to art school. Okay.
And the average radon level in a house in the United States is 1.6, I think it is.
1.6 is,
Yep.
That's cool. That's,
The average.
let's talk about PFAS.
Yes. So that is a generic term for over 3,000 different man-made chemicals. And they are waterproofing chemicals, surfactants, firefighting chemicals, and they've been used since the 1950s, I believe. And so they get into the groundwater in different ways. Firefighting foam that runs off the airports, mishandling of industrial waste, you can get into your groundwater. There's two main PFAS chemicals that they're trying to keep track of to regulate, because what do they have? More analytical lab, what is it? They have testing for two. They don't have testing for all of them, just two primary ones. And so the level for those they want to keep is under 70 parts per trillion.
Okay.
But PFAS are in everything. It's in food containers, it's in your 3M waterproofing products, it's in cosmetics, it's in bug sprays, it's in everything.
We know that we've discovered high PFAS levels in certain wells up in the Rockford area.
Yes.
We know that we have discovered elevated PFAS levels in the aquifer that Plainfield Township has and draws its supply of water from. Plainfield Township has filters on it. That aquifer, as I understand, runs from underneath Versluis Park over by Northland Drive all the way over to Algoma Road past US 131. That whole area underneath there is an aquifer that Plainfield Township is pulling its water for its public water supply. But they have put filters on that. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Please, if anyone knows, verify that.
I'm assuming if they have elevated levels that they're treating it somehow. That would.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that,
Yes.
that Plainfield Township providing their public water system up there does. However, that doesn't mean that community wells such as private condominium wells that service the condominium are doing that. So when you're involved with that or in a single family residence that has its own well, I encourage you, if you're anywhere near that aquifer, and I'm talking within 10 miles, I would encourage you to tell your buyers to have it checked for PFAS, because you don't know what aquifer that well is currently tapping into. So be very aware. As Jean says, it's everywhere.
Yep.
There's no way we can avoid it. What we are looking for is exceptionally high levels, unusually high levels that could, over time, impact our health. Okay? Any questions on that? And Amanda has a question, which we're going to get to shortly, Amanda, about asbestos. We'll be right there very shortly. I'm going to skip to underground storage tanks.
Okay.
What do you? Okay.
USTs.
USTs.
Underground storage tanks.
Yeah. Wow, they can be a real joy.
Yes.
I have other words, but I can't say them here. How do you know if a property has an underground storage tank? Let's start with that one. How do you know if it's there?
So the telltale signs for an underground storage tank that's not in the basement, because that's a different one. So there are every underground storage tank has to have two things above ground. That's a vent pipe and a fill pipe. So you would want to look for those two items. They would typically be near a foundation of the house, because they want to keep the tank closer to the house so they have shorter pipe runs. Vent pipes, usually they would be up alongside the house, and they would have a cap on them to keep water from getting into the pipe.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want any rain in their water. And then a fill pipe is typically would be a 2-inch diameter galvanized pipe of some sort with a screw top on it.
Like
Or
an old
top.
gas
Yes.
tank cap.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And they're usually fairly close to each other, those two things.
Okay. What happens when you see that? What should, as a real estate agent, what should your next step be?
I would verify that there is a tank there. If there's if they're still using it, if there's a fuel oil furnace, that's a big sign. If you have a fuel oil furnace, you probably have a fuel oil tank. You want to make sure that the tank is sound, it's not leaking, because a leaking tank, you likely have groundwater well, and so it could impact your groundwater, your neighbor's groundwater. Vapors could migrate into your basement and accumulate in your basement if you have a leak on your tank.
How would you determine if it has a leak?
If you're using more fuel than you typically would use, if there's the vegetation around the tank is dying, if you have odors coming into your basement, it could be coming from the groundwater into your basement, vaporizing. But likely would be if you're going through more than you would normally go through.
Okay. If you had an underground storage tank that was still in use and you knew that that was providing fuel to your oil furnace, for example, would you recommend doing a soil sample where the soil sample is essentially drilled under the tank to determine whether or not any of the soil has been contaminated?
Usually for UST testing, the samples are collected on either end of the tank. So if you know which direction the tank is lying in the ground, you would sample on the ends of that tank.
Okay, good information. If the tank is not being used, how do we verify that it has been safely, properly abandoned?
So if a tank, if it's not being used for a year, it should be removed. All the fuel in the tank should be pumped out. If it's not close to the structure, you can have it removed by a qualified tank person, and it needs to be cleaned. And then you can send it to a scrap metal yard for recycling or a landfill. If it's under a structure or too close to a structure, then it should be cleaned in place and then filled with an inert material like sand or pea gravel or concrete slurry or something like that, because the tank eventually will rot out and it'll create a sinkhole and it'll be an issue.
Ah, interesting.
So you want to make sure that if it's left in place, it's filled with something.
And who within our governmental units would oversee the proper abandonment of a tank that's not being used or has to be removed?
So if a tank is under 1,100 gallons in size, it does not have to be, a site assessment does not have to be conducted on a tank.
Okay.
So a homeowner technically could take care of it themselves. If it's over 1,100 gallons, then it has to be, paperwork has to be filed with LARA. Which branch of LARA is it? The UST's? I don't remember which
DEQ?
one. It's LARA. Can't remember who it is now.
We'll check it out.
Yep.
At some point, and this goes back a while, so it may have changed in the decades ago, since decades ago, but at one point there was a fire marshal.
Yes. They're not involved in that anymore.
Fire marshal's not involved in that anymore.
Nope.
So
For excavating, though, you probably have to get a permit from your local municipality for excavation.
okay, so if it's got to be removed, talk to the municipality
Yep. Find out
about
what they require.
getting a permit.
Yep.
Let's see here. What if you are aware that there's an environmental defect in the property, but the seller chooses to not include them on the seller's disclosure form? Let's say, for example, what's the incident of vermiculite?
Yep.
Okay. For any of you who are old enough, I am, to remember vermiculite, I used to play with it. It's kind of fun to squish, and then we found out it's a carcinogen. Okay, so thanks, Mom and Dad.
Just like mercury.
It is like mercury, yes, which explains a lot. Okay, fine. Anyway, let's pretend that your cellar knows that there's vermiculite in the attic being used as insulation. They've witnessed it, but they're not going to put it on the seller's disclosure form. As a real estate agent, what should you do?
I would have second thoughts, because I would want to have full disclosure on anything, because it's going to come back and bite you.
I think the short answer is run.
Yeah.
Run fast.
Yes.
There is no listing in the world worth going to court over. It will create an enormous amount of sideways energy, and it raises the question whether or not you are bound under your agency relationship of disclosure and confidentiality if the seller is essentially circumventing the law, which requires that they disclose to the best of their knowledge what the condition of the property is. So if they flat out lie, are you bound by that confidentiality? And many attorneys will argue that no, you're not. In fact, you have a responsibility under our code of ethics, fair dealing with the public, to disclose that information. But you may find yourself in court because the seller may sue you for disclosing information that they perceive to be private. It's a very, very dangerous position to be in. So, run. Okay. Amanda asks, what concerns should a buyer have if a house has asbestos siding as well as an asbestos furnace? I know the furnace can be costly, but I've not run across the siding before. It looks like wood shaker style. Yeah.
So the siding is called transite. It's like transite. It's a cement board type of siding. Typically, that is at least 10% asbestos.
All right.
Yep. As long as it's in good shape, it's not falling apart. If it's not disintegrating, usually it's better sometimes to leave those things in place, because you're going to create more of a problem removing it.
If you remove the siding, for example, I'm gonna stay with the siding just for a second. If you remove the siding, does it need to be done by a team with a hazmat suit on? I mean, what regulations would become involved if that were to be removed?
A homeowner can do whatever they want, unfortunately.
Did you hear that? The homeowner can do whatever they want.
Yes. So the homeowner can remove the siding in any means they want to. Not recommended, but they can. That's their prerogative, I guess. Because the asbestos is bound in that material, it's not as the problem with asbestos is when it becomes airborne. If it's not airborne, if it's in good condition, then typically it's sometimes safer to leave it in place, which would be the case with the siding if it's in good shape.
Which brings us to, if you run into this kind of siding, would it be wise to paint it in order to seal it from becoming airborne?
Yeah, you can paint it.
Okay.
It's a barrier on it to help keep it intact.
Something like would Kills do that, or would it be something else?
There's special products you can buy, but I would think any paint is gonna.
Okay. I'm not allowed tools. This is the only tool I got.
No scraping, no sanding.
No sanding. No sanding. Good call. No sanding.
No sanding, no scraping of transite.
Okay. All right. Now to the octopus furnace. Don't we love them?
Yeah.
No, we don't.
I'm surprised there's still any of them around.
There are still around, and you'll find them in various places. You've probably heard the term friable asbestos.
Mm-hmm.
Friable asbestos is when the asbestos covering and tape has become brittle and is easily cracked. It is friable. Okay? That's hence the term. Now, there are a couple of ways to deal with that. Obviously, if the furnace has to be replaced, if the buyer feels as though they don't want to buy it with that, then someone has to remove that furnace and the asbestos and somehow try to avoid having the asbestos blow around in the home.
Yes.
I'm sorry, what did you say earlier?
Airborne.
The homeowner can
Can do whatever they want.
the homeowner can do whatever they want.
Yep, not recommended.
Not recommended, because in the process of removing friable asbestos, it is virtually guaranteed that it is going to get into the air, become airborne, and that may go through the house, particularly when you put a forced air furnace in there, and now it starts blowing what was in the ductwork that wasn't replaced, for
Yes.
example. So it's a very challenging situation. Some octopus furnaces have more asbestos than others. Some have none. The only way you're going to know for sure is to have it tested.
Yes.
If it is covering the entire ductwork, there's a really, really, really high probability it has asbestos, and if it is starting to flake or become friable, it is you have to be extremely careful about how you approach it. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yes. That product can become airborne very easily, and it stays suspended in the air for a long time. It doesn't settle out very well. I actually have a house that I own with an octopus furnace in it that has asbestos on it.
I won't ask. Anyway, Andrea,
I have friends that do abatement.
and very often when an abatement team comes in, they will actually create a barrier and essentially suck anything airborne into a vacuum inside that barrier, so that they are actually taking any danger away as they break down the furnace.
Yes, it's called a HEPA filter, HEPA vac, and then that actually blows outside. So it's connected to the chamber that they're using. There's different methods of removing the pipe. You have bags that you can wrap around the pipe, and you can put your hands in these gloves to get in there to do it. A lot of water is used. Water helps knock down the asbestos fibers. So
Okay.
and the water is amended water. And everything has to be deconned. The people going in, the people coming out, all the plastic has to be disposed of as asbestos waste. Everything has to be disposed of as asbestos waste.
Yeah. So it's complicated.
Yes.
Um,
Don't do it yourself.
Don't do it yourself. It's not worth it.
Nope.
Andrea has a question. Back to the storage tank. How do you know how big the tank is?
So I did some research. A 1 to 2 bedroom house, typically a tank would be 275 gallons. A 3 to 4 bedroom house, the tanks are typically under 500 gallons. And so to come into contact with a tank that's 1,100 gallons I think would be quite rare.
Yeah. The other method I've seen used is they actually take a sonar.
GPR?
Whatever they use to find metal under the ground.
Metal detector?
Metal detector, and they actually figure out the length and width of the tank, the underground tank, by using the metal detector or a sonar, getting a sonar picture of it.
Yeah, you can use a metal rod too. to kind of outline the perimeter of it.
So there are some options as to figure out how large it is, but as Gene says, 1,100 tank, gallon tank is going to be a pretty big, unusually big tank in most cases.
Plus, you can also call the fuel oil distributor and find out how much they usually put in it.
There you go. So, I hope you found that informative. Lot of information when it comes to environmental stuff. So if you have a question on here about whatever you have, pop in, ask the question. Gene or I will, or anyone else will provide you an answer, and hopefully it's the correct one. But whenever you get a serious environmental issue, consult an expert.
Yes.
Don't answer questions that you don't know the answers to. Anything to add?
No, it's always good to get the advice of a professional. I mean, just
Okay.
for consulting to find out what you're getting into.
Sounds great. Thank you, Gene. Appreciate
You're
you being
welcome.
here.
Thank you.
Have a great week, everyone. Sun's shining. Go at it. All right. See you next week.